in many of these areas, it's been my experience in my life that it's looked like watching a train reaching the desired destination, that is, at the station of equality. And as it draws in, suddenly getting ahead of steam, shooting off down the tracks, off the tracks, and scattering people in its wake. What I mean by that is the weaponization of things at the stage at which they've never got better, where they're presented as if they've never been worse. And I just urge people to take their foot off that pedal a little bit. That isn't to say don't keep moving, but don't lean on heuristics you've come to very recently this hard. I'm looking forward to discussing this. I've been thinking about this subject for a long time, and as was just mentioned, wrote a book that just came out in English, German, I think it's about to come out in French and other languages, called The Madness of Crowds, which is an attempt to try to think about some of these things that are going on, some of the what I describe as crowd madnesses that particularly the online world encourages, where very often we cancel people, destroy people for saying something that everyone thought until 24 hours ago. I think we can identify certain trends that are going on, and one of them is that there are a set of what I describe as tripwire issues, which any journalist, citizen, absolutely anybody, if they just nick one of these tripwires with their foot, can find causes total career implosion. I say they come down roughly to gay, everything to do with women, particularly relations between the sexes, everything to do with race, and absolutely everything to do with trans. A lot of these phenomena at the moment seem to me to be particularly prevalent in Britain, America, Canada, Australia. A number of other countries, particularly across Europe, do have bits of it, but including France, but almost nowhere, actually nowhere as virulently as in the countries I've just listed. Let me, as it were, do the opposite of straw manning and try to steel man this, because this is something I also happen to agree with. It seems that one of the things we're trying to do is a very noble aspiration, and it's something like this. We're trying to come to a position where somebody with a competency, indeed anybody with a competency in a particular area, is never held back from achieving what they could achieve because of some characteristic. So no young girl growing up anywhere thinks they can't be something because they're a girl. Nobody who's LGBT thinks they can't get anywhere because of their sexuality, and nobody, whatever their skin colour, is held back from anywhere because of their skin colour. That seems to be almost agreed upon. I put it out there as I say, it's one that almost across political sides you could say is a common aspiration. The problem that I try to identify and go into among other things is, what if we're, in trying to achieve that, doing something that's making things an awful lot worse? Now, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what I would describe as an overcorrection that's happening in the media on this issue, as I would argue in others as well. And I'm going to focus on two news organisations quickly, the BBC and the New York Times. I'm not singling them out for any reason other than that they are very prominent news organisations with well-deserved international reputations. One weekend in 2018 on the BBC's website, the front page news website in the BBC, one of the top stories was that the diver Tom Daley had felt inferior about his sexuality, but that it had given him motivation to succeed. This was one of the top stories on the website. It was 5 years after Daley had come out, and just underneath that was news that a tsunami in Indonesia had killed at least 800 people. One day later, and the BBC's front page of the news website had as one of its lead stories that day the news that a minor reality television star in Britain called Ollie Locke had announced that he and his fiancée, Gareth Locke, were going to join their surnames to become the Locks after their forthcoming nuptials. Underneath that was the headline that the death toll in Indonesia had risen significantly overnight. The New York Times, on the 16th of October 2017, this is the international edition of the New York Times, the business section leads with a two-page story headlined "Gay in Japan and No Longer Invisible." And it relays a story of a Japanese businessman who had come out in his office in Tokyo and nobody had any problem with it. And what's more, as the story went on to say, Japan isn't a very homophobic society. So this was, man comes out in not very homophobic country and nobody cares. But that was the 2 pages of lead news story in the New York Times. If you turned to the culture section in the New York Times that day, there was a picture of 2 men dancing, and it was the news that the New York City Ballet had decided to turn one of the female roles into a male role so that two men were dancing together, and they had a massive news story about what an incredible breakthrough this was in the obviously previously very virulently heterosexual world of ballet. So, but for some reason we have fallen, and we can get into why perhaps, into this very strange fragmented view of society which fragments along these very specific lines. And I'm going to finish because I'm conscious of the clock, but I just wanted to finish by saying this. What if all of this isn't making things better? What if it isn't erasing these differences? What if it isn't saying to people you can be whatever you want to be, but it's actually making these differences accentuated? It's playing off races against each other, it's playing off the sexes against each other, it's playing off sexual minorities against majorities. What if we're not doing something that's making things better, but just doing something that's making it an awful lot worse?
He raises so many good points. For whatever reason, the media is obsessed with these topics and they just keep forcing them. You watch a movie, you're gonna get force-fed these ideologies. You watch a cartoon, you're getting force-fed these ideologies. You go to school, you're getting force-fed these ideologies. You go to work, you're getting force-fed these ideologies. Every aspect of your life, you are forced to encounter these ideologies that have absolutely no bearing on what you're there for.
The guy you see on the screen right now is Ben van der Kooi. And last night, Dutch media outlet Rijnmond.nl, that serves as a regional broadcaster and is partly publicly funded, published a big portrait, as they call it, of him, of Ben van der Kooi, highlighting his patriotic activism. The rest of us in the Netherlands know that van der Kooi is a multiple convicted neo-Nazi who got to speak freely in a written piece online and a podcast facilitated by a public news source. I can safely say from my own personal experience that it seems to me that more can be said by some, rather than as well as less by others in the current political climate, at least in the Netherlands. Right-wing discourse is on the rise in my home country, and on a daily basis people say the harshest things about non-binary people, women, people of colour, Muslims, refugees, people with disabilities, undocumented people, basically everybody that isn't a white, male, able-bodied of a certain age. 2 decades ago, this was unthinkable, or at least it would have been considered improper or just insulting. Issues like racial profiling by police, for example, are justified right now as a necessary evil, rather than recognizing its structural racism. Because you see, it's not that it is no longer allowed to say what you want to say. It's about being held accountable for what one says, taking responsibility for the words and the language that one uses. One has to be aware that words are not neutral, that they have histories and connotations, and one just cannot ignore that. Words have power, and they can reinforce systems of inequality and suppression. Thus, you can still use these words. You can still be free to speak, yet you need to be aware of what you're saying, and that if your words are racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, well, somebody might just call you a racist, a sexist, a homophobe, or a transphobe. People will respond to it. So yes, you can say whatever you want to say. All you have to do is own your words and expect others to respond to what you're saying. So, as long as you own what you say, as far as I'm concerned, you can say anything. We can talk about anything.
As per usual with these people, they say a lot of things that sound great in theory, but when you delve a little deeper, it starts to look very sinister. You start to see a lot of ideologically captured and agenda-driven nonsense. It's expert level gaslighting. It's like, hey, just don't be a racist, and we won't call you a racist. But also, guess what? Let's broaden the definition of racist so that anything you do that makes me unhappy makes you a racist. So have fun. Dictionary was ideologically captured, so now you can't even trust the words and the definitions that are being used. They're playing this little game, hoping no one sees it.
I think listening to both of you and looking at your work, what comes across to me is whether the struggle for rights, be they gay or gender, LGBT, whether the battle has been won or not, because many feel that they need to keep shouting, pushing with language, because they feel, for example, there is not equality in whatever sphere it is that we might want to talk about. So that could be gay rights, that could be women's rights, that could be racial justice. How do you feel, Douglas, when we talk about that? Do you feel, when I read your book, it came across to me that you feel a lot of the battles were almost won?
Well, I do. I use this analogy that in many of these areas, it's been my experience in my lot of life that it's looked like watching a train reaching the desired destination, that is, at the station of equality. And as it draws in, suddenly getting ahead of steam, shooting off down the tracks, off the tracks, and scattering people in its wake. What I mean by that is the weaponization of things at the stage at which they've never got better, where they're presented as if they've never been worse. And I just urge people to take their foot off that pedal a little bit. That isn't to say don't keep moving, but don't lean on heuristics you've come to very recently this hard.
Savannah, what would you respond?
Well, I always think it's necessary to really understand that even though my emancipation has reached a certain level where I can say that I now have certain privileges, it doesn't mean to say that that goes for everybody who's part of, let's say, that particular group that's identifying within a certain scope. So let's make it more concrete and say that it's fine if you're a female executive, like myself, for instance. I'm a female party leader. So it's easy for me to say that that's doable, that's possible. If I can do it, anybody can do it. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of young women who look like me do not have the same privileges and are still fighting so many battles that maybe I've overcome because of, Lord knows why, it could be just my, my dominant character. But it's not to say that they have the same opportunities and the same privileges, so they still have a long way to go. And I know from experience that it's important for them to have role models and people that speak out on their behalf.
Well, let me pass it back to Douglas then. Do you feel you can always speak as freely as you want to?
Myself, yes. I think that I'm in a very privileged position. I know this from audiences and readers who are in touch with me, that increasingly the things I describe which have caused career destruction for very eminent people. And what I'm struck by now is the extent to which people who are not self-employed journalists and writers feel that they can't say the things that some people in public can say. So, for instance, let me give one very quick example. I did this on the BBC the other week, that this issue came up with this pop singer Sam Smith, who described himself as non-binary. And I got into a certain amount of trouble that didn't bother me, but because I said I don't think there's any such thing, or at least no one's explained what it is sufficiently for me to agree to it. Now, I know from feedback, including feedback in the studio from certain people at the BBC, that this is not an unpopular thing to say. I would think that if you went out to the general public and said, do you think there are people who are non-binary, and if so, can you say what they are? You'd get a fragment of 1% of people able to say that. And so my point on that is not that I've closed the argument on that, but we haven't had the argument on the whole set of things, and it seems only to be a few people who do have a voice in public who can have it.
I'm always surprised that certain people feel that they need to give their okay for other people to be or think something they don't necessarily understand. It doesn't matter whether I understand the beauty of physical love between two men. There's no point. You don't need my permission to feel and act. So why does Sam Smith or anybody else who considers himself non-binary needs permission from whoever? All that is up to us is to say, if this is important to you, and it does not affect me in any type of way, in any type of negative way, I'm going to respect that.
I like how she revises that. Any type of way, actually any type of negative way. Any type of negative way. Stop. Stop. When you're being told to shut up and believe, or you're evil and we're going to come for you and ruin your life, there's no argument about it's not affecting you.
So if you say that you're offended by blackface every year, then I don't need to understand how come you're offended. All I need to do is say, this is not my intention. How can I fix it? And if you say you can fix it by stop acting that way, then that's what I'll do, because there is no...
She's got to be joking. So we're just going to appease anyone who has any disagreement about the way things are. We're just going to appease them and their emotion. No question about, hey, are you being reasonable? Like, maybe let's talk about it. Nope, we're just going to, you don't like that? All right, we're gonna stop it.
People don't need your permission to be whoever they want to be.
I think it's slightly more complex than that, if I can say so.
Of course.
Let me give one reason why. Actually, the Sam Smith thing was significant. Again, sorry to go on about the BBC. The BBC's reporting of that immediately did what he asked, which was that they changed the pronouns. And some people think this isn't a big thing. Some of us do get a bit stuck on this.
I'm going to interrupt you just so everybody is up to speed with the sense of, instead of he, she, him, her, non-binary people often want to use they, them. So it would be...
So my point was simply that if you haven't actually had this out in public, you haven't actually discussed much of it, it's a bit strange that a major news organisation would slip into saying exactly what a person had asked themselves to be described as simply because they had asked for it.
Sounds like respect to me.
It's not
nothing more, nothing less.
It's not the same thing as respect because it's something which we haven't had out. He himself said, I don't know what it means to be non-binary. So my suggestion was he should go away and think about it. And in the meantime, we shouldn't all mutilate the language to fit around it.
Why? If I come on this stage and I say to you, I would prefer for you to call me Mr. Simons, why is it a problem to you to just give me that respect?
But well, I'm afraid that because I care about the language, I didn't particularly want to say they was very good in their performance last night.
Well,
I'm not going to do it simply because of... there is a more important thing I may say,
sure,
which is that actually this one is a very niche bit of a thing. Whether a pop star thinks they're non-binary or gender queer or whatever, is not that significant. Now, there is one that's very significant, which we're all tripping over now, which is the trans one. And you mentioned the thing about the phobia there. There is a real problem in our societies on this one, because actually in the media, people are petrified now of writing about this issue. But outside there in the country, as you can see from a new poll that's about to come out tomorrow, the general public are deeply concerned about being dismissed as transphobes when you're talking about how you deal with children. And that isn't a small concern. It's not just about pronouns. It's a legitimate concern of the general public about the well-being of children. I'm bothered when people make assertions which we haven't litigated in public yet. And on a whole set of issues at the moment, the way I see it is, I'm sure you're all people who've seen sheepdogs in operation, but if you see a sheepdog trying to get a herd of sheep, it doesn't need to go and force them into a corner. It goes and it not even nips, but pretends to nip around the edges, and that way you can make everyone move like this. There is a real and significant risk in our society with the free press at the moment that people coming and making very slight nips around the edges make the whole herd move in another direction. And that is exactly what's happened with this.
What are you worried about will be the end result?
I'm worried that we tell little lies, and we get used to little lies, and then we tell bigger ones. I think it's a lie to pretend that biology doesn't matter. I think it's unwise to pass those things through always simply because of courtesy. Courtesy, I happen to agree, is one of the bedrocks of society. It's very important to be courteous, but that's not... Courtesy has a limit, and the limit is when it makes people...
I used the word respect, and there's a big difference between courtesy and respect. Respect is what we absolutely need in order to live together on this planet as a diverse society, something that is hard to accept for certain people, but we are a diverse society. What we see happening is new perspectives coming in, new people saying we want to have our seat at the table because we can either represent ourselves or, as myself, have been given the mandate to represent certain groups of people.
Again, people should just be able to do whatever they want. It's a playground. We're in fun world. Just do what you want to do. If people want to do it, they should be able to do it. Fun world. When you see me, make sure to address me as the great explorer, perfect. Did I say perfect? Say, did I say too? Don't forget that. That's going to piss me off if you don't. Human, prolific artist.
2 hours later.
YouTuber extraordinaire. Make sure to like the video and subscribe. Address me as that when you see me. And do not forget any part of it, because that would really hurt me and piss me off.
On the diversity issue, I entirely agree, of course. I mean, our societies are trying to cope with a very swift increase in diversity of the kind that we've been talking about.
There's always been diversity. There's always been diversity. There's always been black people, Asian people, different gender people, different sexual preferences.
There's been some.
Always have been around.
Just one at a time, so we can...
Of course there's been some, but I'm saying not like this. And we are struggling with it. And I would suggest there's a useful lesson for speech in this from a very good book by the Danish journalist Flemming Rose, who wrote a book called The Tyranny of Silence a few years ago. He made a point that I think is just worth us bearing in mind, which is, he said, in his view, that there were only two ways you could go with dealing with an increasingly diverse society. You, broadly speaking, had the choice of limiting speech or having to get people used to the fact there'd be more speech than they'd ever been used to before. And of the two, the latter, despite how painful it is far more preferable. I think the interesting thing about the whole issue of offence is not... The problem with the claiming of offence is that it is not that it is... Obviously, sometimes people, a lot of the time, people say things that are offensive. Happens to most of us every day. But the problem is not that. The problem is the use of "I'm offended by that" as effectively a synonym for "shut up." That is commonplace, and that just needs some pushing back. My suggestion, for going from what somebody said at Vox a while ago, was why don't we try to start working out, as an interim measure, listening to each other's words and trying to hear them honestly.
But why don't we start thinking about what we say and what we do before? Why don't we start there? Why don't we take responsibility for the things we say and do before we offend
I agree,
people?
but my suggestion is, I say, if we could do this, if we could practice it across lines, it would mean that we try to listen to other people in the spirit of generosity. And what we're doing at the moment is deliberately listening to people in the hope that there is something underneath the words that we can work out and we can... So my suggestion is just start with that. But I'm so glad you raised it because it's the single most unaddressed question in our society that needs addressing.
Anyways, that's the video. Make sure to like and subscribe. Comment below if you agree or disagree. Let me know how you would like to be addressed in your list of demands that you want the world to live by. We'll see what we can do, but I'll see you guys later. Peace.